but it's not spirit.
Sorry about that. I hit that
No
button a little
problem.
too late.
On religion and spirituality, people's complaint is that the teachings, the texts, the experiences are not spiritual in my mind, meaning addressing the inner life, addressing the soul, addressing the core of our being. People say I'm spiritual but not religious, which typically means I have not found religion to be spiritually satisfying.
Right.
So they might have a spiritual propensity,
Mm.
but many people who say that I'm spiritual but not religious, I have found they actually haven't done any real work in cultivating spirituality. It's more of an attitude
Yes.
than actual accomplishment. I'm not saying that people aren't inherently spiritual, but being inherently spiritual and working a spiritual path are two very different things.
Mm.
So the opposition shouldn't be there. If a person does not have a religion, I believe they should work a spiritual path. If they have a religion, they should be taught how to work a spiritual path within the religion. Because unfortunately, text, dogma, institutions, rituals are not inherently spiritual. There has to be an inner life appropriation. So if a person has not been taught how to make the spirit present to the religion and have the religion evoke spiritual experience, then of course they're not going to be able to use a religion or their religion for spiritual purposes.
Very nice. And within the Jewish tradition, then you describe yourself as being trans-denominational, which I find that very interesting. Uh, you are a Reform rabbi, am I correct?
Reform ordained. Yeah.
Reform ordained, yes. That's a very important distinction as well. But you describe on your website and in other ways what you have gained from all of the different
Right.
strands of rabbinic Judaism.
Correct.
Yeah. So you use also the term wisdom works, which I assume we're talking about chokmah here. We're talking about biblical wisdom. We're talking about uh, uh, the tradition, Jewish tradition, in terms of how you approach it. And then, of course, I wanted to introduce that statement while talking about how it's kind of the trend. If you want to publish a book today in mental health or something and get attention, you usually put the new science of.
Mm-hmm.
We see that a lot in many things.
Mm-hmm.
So, what is there to be said about? I'm sure, aside from new insights through research, through experimentation, and so forth, but isn't there something to be said also about the tried and true wisdom of?
I'm religiously, I'm conservative. I'm not saying anything new.
Yeah.
Uh, I'm saying old things to people who are present now. But I've also noticed a need. So my message is tailored for people today who are lost in many ways. First of all, in their own spiritual search,
Mhm.
in interpersonal relationships, in questions about many different things, important questions in our lives, including politics, including understanding themselves, other people. So, as far as wisdom works, um, I used to call that which I teach spiritual psychology,
I see.
meaning a psychology rooted in the notion of spirit. So, very, in a way, opposed to traditional therapeutic psychology, anything in the psychodynamic tradition.
Hmm.
I don't believe in the model. I don't believe it works as it should. If it does work, it's because you have a good person, a good practitioner, and a willing client. But I think the medicine doesn't make it work. In many ways, I think if traditional psychodynamic therapy works, it's despite the method, not because of the method. My personal opinion, again, from highly anecdotal evidence. So when I would teach the spiritual psychology, it was more precisely the spiritual psychology of the Kabbalah. I'm a professor of Jewish mysticism. I've been studying Kabbalah my entire adult life.
Hmm.
I teach what's called the um, Lurianic Kabbalah, which you don't go into now, but it's based on the idea of the brokenness in the divine. And since we are created in the divine image, we are each born with a kind of brokenness. Uh, Now, when we think of our brokenness on practical matters, I focus on I'll mention three of the 10 emanations that are discussed in the Kabbalah. The three that I'm mostly concerned with are Hesed, as you know, which means love, beneficence, kindness. Gevura, which means strength,
Mhm.
but is also called Din, which means rationality or law.
Mhm.
And then the interface of the two of these sometimes is called Emet, truth, and sometimes it's called Tiferet, beauty. So my program was based in love, justice, truth, and beauty. So what I noticed was that people did not love well, did not know how to love well, how to receive love well. And it was, in many ways, a very basic misunderstanding what I would call a metaphysical reality.
Mhm.
So there is something called the standard of loving well. No one ever taught it. No one ever learned it. It's the same with justice, which is justice as fairness, justice as respect. You know, what we owe people on the moral level. You might call the second one I'm talking about morality,
Yes, or righteousness even.
righteousness, exactly, all of those. So notice morality, righteousness, virtue, etc., are all concepts of restraint. You can't say anything you want. You can't do anything you want. You have to live by an honor code.
Right.
Now, the integration of the two, which is emet, tiferet, emet, that takes us into the deeper recesses of the human being or the further reaches of the human personality.
Mm-hmm.
So I taught it that way for years, but then I realized that after many years of teaching, if people would come to class, almost all of their questions were about gevura, about honor,
Yeah.
restraint, virtue,
Mm-hmm.
because people lost their tempers.
Mm-hmm.
Other people lost their tempers. People became defensive. They couldn't regulate. So I'm going to put all of that into the realm of what I call gevura, and we'll say the sphere of virtue.
Okay.
Okay. But I didn't want to simply call it my program virtue because, of course, virtue is a strategy to achieve wisdom. So I began to call my program Wisdom and Virtue, or Virtue and Wisdom. And I would teach more or less the same things, but I began to reorganize everything to specifically teach people virtue, which means I think I burn up a lot of time teaching Kabbalah, which people didn't need. It was way too much for the the pointedness of what I wanted to teach people was how to be virtuous, wise people in every level.
And I was going to ask you if I may.
Sure.
I assume that in many cases you have to do a lot of unteaching in terms
Correct.
of Kabbalah before you can get to the teaching about Kabbalah.
Correct. People, whatever they know is not correct
Yeah.
typically. Listen, there's a lot to learn there.
Sure.
I just found it wasn't efficient in what people needed to know
Yeah.
to repair their marriage,
Mm-hmm.
repair their relationship with their child, address their own depression, anxiety, guilt, shame. It was too much of a method for a very pointed teaching that I wanted to accomplish. So I put Kabbalah aside. I mean, if
Mm-hmm.
I want to teach Kabbalah, I would just say it's a class on the spiritual psychology of Kabbalah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And I would teach what I wanted to teach. Pause. Can you hear background noise?
I do not. No.
Okay, good. We're fine.
Okay.
All right. So I began to call it wisdom and virtue, virtue and wisdom. And then I really thought about this a lot.
Mm-hmm.
To use the word wisdom, not only in the biblical sense, because remember, chokhmah in the Bible can mean skill.
Yes. Right.
Chokhmah in the Bible can have a sense of da'at, of great knowledge. So
Mm-hmm.
there's not one meaning of chokhmah in the
Sure.
Bible. So I used it in an intersection of both Greek and Jewish thinking.
Mm-hmm.
You might say as the ideal regulator of human consciousness and human conduct. I
Yes.
had to give it some name.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Now, so under Chokhmah is knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Under Chokhmah is virtue. Under Chokhmah is rationality.
Mm-hmm.
So I picked an arc term under which to put everything else, including
Yeah.
the spiritual search. I mean, the spiritual search should be conducted in a wise way.
Yes.
We
Right.
should practice our religions in wise ways. So then I called it wisdom work. It seemed like a fun thing. And then I had a dilemma because wisdom work is a sense of like working the wisdom. But
Oh.
my dad, who was a machinist, for his career,
Mm-hmm.
he'd say, I'm going down to the works, to
Sure.
the place where they made things, aircraft parts.
Okay.
So I thought to myself, what if like wisdom had a works, like a factory? You come in, you take your tools,
Nice.
you
Yeah.
grind things, you perfect things. My dad was a precision machinist for
Nice.
NASA and for
Mhm.
jet aircraft industry. He said he made
Wow.
one tiny error, threw it out, do it again. So I like the idea of like we're showing up to the works. You're like
Yeah.
you want to do wisdom works, come to the factory, and we're going to get you going on shaping, precise grinding out your life of
Yeah.
wisdom.
And even from the biblical perspective, wisdom does not require you to be super intelligent. And a super intelligent person can be very unwise in their
That,
behavior.
that,
So,
that is precisely correct. In fact, the main way the word wisdom is used, more famously in the creating of the Mishkan, the tabernacle,
mhm,
Bezalel, who is the architect, knows how to render a blueprint.
mhm,
I mean, the blueprint for the Mishkan is, according to the Bible, revealed from God to Moses.
yes,
Moses reveals it to Bezalel, and he says,
mhm,
make this thing.
yeah,
So Bezalel can read a blueprint. He can hire engineers. He can fabricate. He knows all of the ways to between metal and fabrics and so forth. So there, it's a kind of grasp of design and the ability to bring the design into
mhm,
reality. So that's what, but I love that as an idea of chokhmah. But he's termed as having chokhmah, tivuna, and the Hebrew word tivuna is normally translated as discernment,
mhm.
the ability to discern one thing from another, which is very difficult for people in the imprecise kind of minds that people have today.
Sure.
They do not learn how to think or speak precisely. People speak with their emotions, not with
Mhm.
any sense of naming something that is, whether it's something metaphysical or something empirical. And the last
Good
term
point.
is da'at,
Yeah.
which is knowledge,
Mhm.
but it's a very our English word knowledge doesn't come close because, as you know, in the Garden of Eden story and throughout the Bible, the word yada is also sexual intercourse.
Right.
People are called Yodei Adonai, the knowers of God.
Yeah.
So knowledge implies if we're going to take the erotic dimension out, it means knowing something to its essence,
Mhm.
knowing something to its core. So
Yes.
now we think that Bezalel had Chokhmah, Tuvuna, and Da'at, which made him qualified to render the Mishkan.
Nice.
So now I've been studying that my whole life. It's a very big part of Kabbalah, by the way.
Mhm.
So I chose Chokhmah as the main word under which I would put everything else.
Sounds nice. It really makes an awful lot of sense to me. Um, and I guess I would not have thought about it when you say wisdom works. I wouldn't have thought of a foundry necessarily, but it definitely works. It's a nice turn of phrase in that
Yeah,
sense. But to me,
yeah.
it's wisdom works.
Works.
Wisdom,
But yeah, there's the
it's
other side of play on words.
yeah,
It actually
yeah,
does work.
it does. Yeah,
So it's both a noun and an activity, which is why I became attached to that.
yeah.
It's
It's
effective,
wonderful.
and for it to be effective, you got to show up to the foundry.
So, if I remember, I'll need to backtrack just a little bit. You said you used to refer to this as spiritual psychology, and now you have moved away from that term. Am I right?
Correct.
Um, but spiritual psychology in contrast to psychodynamic
Correct.
psychology,
Mhm.
because psychodynamic is basically more involved with the human mind or whatnot,
Well, a little more specifically,
or the unconscious.
psychodynamic thinks of the dynamic of ego,
Mm,
id, and superego.
right.
Now, I just don't. I think those terms are worse than useless. I think they mislead people profoundly.
Right.
Freud's idea of psychodynamic theory had a kind of a mechanical dimension
Right.
to it.
Yes, the
You know,
machine model, as a matter of
yeah, it's a
fact.
machine model. It's a hydraulic model.
Yeah. Mhm.
Repression causes symptoms.
Yeah.
If you unrepress through talking therapy, you cure symptoms, but I just don't think it's true.
I agree, and this is absolutely an area where logotherapy and what you're describing are very much alike
Correct.
in that. You know,
Right.
sometimes we refer to the psychodynamic model as the machine model, and uh, James Crumball referred to it as the rat model, I guess, where you
Right.
put a rat in a maze and
Right.
help it
Yeah.
do. But behaviorism and cognitive and all that
Right.
is kind of Uh, but of course, logotherapy is clearly an approach to the spirit. But
Mhm,
what Frankl meant by spirit is, I guess easily described with the German word Geist.
mhm,
But translating things from his writings into English, he always had to deliberate over the choice of words because of the religious connotations that
mhm,
words in English usually have that
right.
I assume don't necessarily happen in German.
Mhm.
So now you say you don't describe as your work as a spiritual psychology or
Well, I'm not saying it's no longer. It's just
yeah,
because when people come to class
yeah,
and there is so much focus on virtue,
mhm.
people came and thought I was teaching spiritual experiences.
Yeah, right. I get you.
And I began to develop a kind of a quip, which is 90% of your energy should go to a contemplative practice that produces virtue,
Hmm.
and 10% on the more overtly spiritual ecstatic.
Yes.
So I didn't want to use the word spiritual because people said, well,
Mhm.
you don't sound very spiritual. You're teaching this kind
Right.
of virtue.
Once
And I would
again, the
say,
connotations of the word spiritual.
but yeah.
Yeah.
So I realized it was as I taught the spiritual psychology of the Kabbalah, and I really wanted to help people,
Mhm.
I realized I need to teach wisdom and virtue directly. So I just stopped
Ah,
using the word because people would come and say, what's this have to do with spirituality? Now, of course, what I would say is a spiritual surge and practice that does not produce virtue is highly suspect.
right.
So
Very
now the
good.
question is, do you teach the spiritual search to arrive at virtue,
Mhm.
or is virtue first? Meaning
Hmm.
you can't conduct the practice if you're not a person of virtue. Now,
Right.
here I take from 12-step programs. I worked in a rehab center for 5, 7 years.
Okay.
To be in the center, you had to stop abusing drugs and alcohol. You
Mhm.
couldn't use. So it's not
Right.
like you came to the center and then eventually you'd stop using.
Right.
You actually had to stop using to get in.
Yes. Okay. Right.
So that's my notion of virtue. When
Mhm.
people would come and say, I want to fix things with my wife or husband, I say, okay, so here's the honor code.
Mhm.
No criticizing, no complaining, no
Yeah.
harsh language, no escalating conflict.
Yes.
Well, what do I do if they do this or they do that? I said, I'll answer your question, but not if you're not in.
Yes. It
Because if
kind
you're not,
of go ahead. Sorry.
yeah, no, if you're not going to join the program, I'm not going to exhaust myself. Now, when I would teach classes, of course, I dealt with this question all the time. And by the way, it was the exact same questions every single class. So I realized this is archetypal. This is not personal.
Right.
The minute you say to somebody, no criticizing, some go, sounds good to me. And other people go, but what about? And so I realized it's a type of person when you actually say to them, they have to restrain themselves. They break out into an emotional rash. The
Right.
idea that they actually have to regulate.
Yes.
So as I went on my class, look, I gave a nice ramp up. I'd explain everything and why, maybe 2 hours of that. I said, now, if you're taking a class of mine, you don't have to do it. But if you want to succeed in wisdom works, you have to take the virtue oath.
Aha.
If you don't want to
Okay.
succeed, fine. Just here for informational purposes, great. But you
Yes.
can't learn how to be sober. You stop
Right.
using. Then we can talk about the inner depths of sobriety.
Nice.
So I focus on virtue because I realized many people were coming and said, well, my spouse said this and I got angry and they said this and I said this. I said, okay, you can have anger. You can't
Yeah.
speak it.
Right.
Don't criticize. You can feel it. Don't say it. And they say, well, I'm repressing. I said, no, it's called restraining, which is the essence of morality.
That's correct. Yes.
There's
Very
no
much.
morality without restraint.
Yeah.
If it comes natural, it's not moral, it's just natural.
We have
So,
a we have a lawyer in our congregation who works with the aviation community, and sometimes there's a pilot who gets a DUI or something, and if they want his help, the first thing he says to them is, "You've just had your last drink of alcohol."
that's exactly right. It's
Yeah.
exactly right. So that's how it became wisdom work with the focus on virtue. And once I became clear to start with virtue, it's like everything else in the system just flowed.
Nice. Yes. Mm.
Right. And that probably began to happen about 2007 or 8. And it took about really 10 years to gestate.
I see.
Had a pretty full version by about 2018 as I go over my old outlines.
Mhm.
And then during COVID, I really sharpened it up, and and I have a couple of books in the process, but
Sure.
one thing at a time.
Oh, I'm very glad to hear that because I definitely would want to read those. Um, I was going to say that there are three elements to logotherapy that are kind of come to mind as you mentioned this. They are spirituality, whatever that means, but also freedom of the will and responsibility. And I don't know what your knowledge is of Viktor Frankl, but I'll mention that he always argued to Americans that if you're going to have a Statue of Liberty on the East Coast, you need to have a statue of responsibility on the West Coast so that
Correct.
there would be that balance between them.
Mhm.
You
That's
may
right.
have known that already.
I did not know that, but that's it's a nice metaphor.
Yeah. But of course, morality, I don't think that, not sure that that's the term that he used. I need to go back and think about it. But definitely from a religious point of view, especially, you really can't have. I think what a lot of people are looking for when they come for counseling, when they go to therapy, or even when they come to certain types of religious institutions, they're looking to serve the self rather than to transform the self.
Mhm.
And it sounds like through your process, you're talking about transformation,
Yeah.
not the the homeostasis model here. We're
No,
not trying to relieve tension. We're trying to, in some ways,
create
create
tension.
tension. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. If a person is, first of all, if there is not homeostasis, it's typically because what they're trying to bring into stasis is flawed to begin with.
Yeah, right.
Um, so it's an entire restructuring of consciousness. So therefore, there is an intellectual architectural dimension to it. I need to show them a model and say, if it makes sense, let's try to have you appropriate this model. And of course, part of the model is duty before anything. And this is where the Jewish component comes in, the idea of mitzvah.
Mhm. Yes.
Um, so, I mean, one thing that I've taught as a corollary to wisdom works is an idea that has four terms: do your duty,
Mhm.
find bliss or authentic happiness when possible. When you can't find bliss, be resilient, and everything matters.
Mhm.
But the first is do your duty.
Right.
Um, and so I believe that whatever you're working on, whether you're working on your physical fitness, you're working on your diet, you're working on a relationship, suddenly there's a duty. Sometimes the duty to talk, sometimes duty is not to talk.
Mhm.
Sometimes the duty is to rest, sometimes duty is to work out. But there's something that your spirit needs.
Mhm.
And with this, you might say, higher self regulator, authentic consciousness, the wise consciousness, and so forth. You know, it's an odd phrase.
Mhm.
It's as if we have to train that higher consciousness to train us. Now, I can
True.
talk about that a
Yes.
lot. It might not be worth it, but maybe you and I would like it. I don't know about your listeners, because it's a highly theoretical idea
Well, I
how
do think
higher
this.
consciousness is shaped by we feeding higher consciousness wisdom from the tradition.
I think that there's a lot of parallels in what you're saying with what Viktor Frankl taught and what this is how I present it in my. I'm responsible for my own mistakes. If like the disclaimers you see in the front of the book, somebody will say, I had great teachers and many of the wonderful things I can present are, from them, and my
Mhm.
mistakes are my own. So let me just say my mistakes are my own. But,
Mhm.
uh, you know, obviously in our field of logotherapy, we talk about there's the physical dimension, the mental dimension, and the spiritual dimension. And of course, I argue, as I mentioned in my email, that logotherapy is pre-religious and not anti-religious.
Of course.
And I think this is something we have to emphasize because Viktor Frankl was a very religious man.
Mhm.
And he remained so throughout his life. In his latter writings, his earliest writings and his later writings, very, very religious. And he brings in the Bible and scriptures and so forth a lot. So that
Mhm.
it would be a mistake to say that it's a
Of course.
secular, although he wrote that it was a secular approach. But I know what he's doing. He's trying to avoid it being baptized into Christianity or whatever, and
Mhm.
there is that.
Mhm.
There are people who can take it and try to twist it and use it or whatever. But I say it's pre-religious. But when we talk about the spiritual, he's talking about the higher part of who we are, but not necessarily the mind,
Mhm.
you know.
Correct.
And the mind to me is like the hard drive on a computer. It takes in everything, and many times it spits it back out. And I'll hear a song on the radio in the morning, and tomorrow in the afternoon it'll be echoing in my mind, but that's not my higher faculty.
Correct.
You know, my higher
Exactly right.
faculty is the part that says, I don't like that song. Let me choose something else.
Mhm.
Or, so anyway, I think we're very similar in that
Right.
mentality.
We
But
have to
you
have a sense of
talking,
the higher self.
yes, and
Sure.
that's what you call it, the higher self.
I call it the higher self. Right.
Yeah.
And it's a placeholder to have the discussion.
Mhm.
We cannot define the term mind. We can't define the term authentic self. So let's say it's a
Yes.
realm of activity.
Mhm.
And in discussing it, we have better and better understandings. But
Yes.
I'm just going to assert
Mhm.
there is a higher self according to which we regulate thoughts, feelings, emotions, drives, and impulses.
Yes.
So the fact that I think something doesn't mean I'm thinking well,
Correct.
right? So we're actually using thought to regulate thought, which is theoretically difficult. I think you and I could figure that out without too
Mhm.
much trouble. But
Yes.
I just say to people, you think something, but you know it's not true. You
Mhm.
think
Right.
something,
Yeah.
but you know it's not a good idea.
Mhm.
According to what?
Yeah. And
Some
where did that
other
come
kind of.
from? You know,
Yeah,
yeah.
right. So what I try to do is help people animate that what I call the higher self to regulate what I call the unconscious ego self.
Mhm. Nice. So again, I think there's a lot of similarity there. There was another Viennese Jewish man named Joseph Fabry who came here, and he wrote a book called Signposts to Meaning. And basically, he talks about ways that people get to meaning in their life. But and I'm saying it here so that nobody can steal this from me. But I add a corollary to that, and that is if you're on the road and you have signposts that are leading you to your destination, you've also got billboards and you've got
Mhm.
these advertisements that are trying to distract
Yeah,
you or trying to sell you
right.
something that you don't want to buy necessarily. Uh, and there's a stretch of road from Macon, which is a town in the center, close to the center of Georgia, down to Florida.
Mhm.
And on that road, there's a military base, and so there's like this war of billboards between very conservative evangelical churches and anti-abortion propaganda and so forth, and on the other hand, strip clubs and adult stores and all that kind of stuff. And so here
Mhm.
you're thinking, I'm taking the kids to Disney World or whatever, but in the meantime, you got all these people trying to pull you off the road or
Right.
redirect your thinking. And to
Right.
me, that's the mind. The mind is just it's you, it's what you put in, or it's what gets put into you, but
Mhm.
it's not the dean, it's not the judgmental, the
Right.
decision making part of you where
Mhm.
you say, well, another bowl of ice cream is not a good idea.
Mhm.
you know
Right. Exactly.
so
Well, so
instinct, drive,
yeah,
and so
sure. And again, uh, you're defining the mind in a certain way, and it's good. Of course, you have to have the another word,
forth. Right.
which someone would say, well, I have a better word, and it really doesn't matter.
Yeah,
I
right.
mean, we can mix these terms up, but it's basically what you're saying is there's a something called, I have enough knowledge to know where I want to go and to look at the billboards and decide which has more truth and which has less truth.
Yes.
Okay. And whatever that higher faculty is called, that's the one I'll trust. But I'm going to give you a kind of a gloomy rejoinder to the
Okay,
image.
sure.
And I say, how do you know who put up the signposts are reliable?
That's right. Yeah.
I mean, how do I assess a signpost?
Yeah, you must have that
So
judgment.
yeah, so this is where I the inner work one has to do to see a signpost and say, well, that's just a slogan. Okay. That doesn't tell me, I mean, it's nice. I like to say it.
Mhm.
People give me slogans all the time. I say, okay, so how does that tell you, how to continue your marriage and how to advise your child and deal with your own, uh, um, the darkness of your soul. So there's a lot of books that have really great slogans. People read and say, "Oh my God, that's so true." But
Yeah.
applying it is an entirely different problem.
Yes.
So that's for me. It's like, look, you can read any signpost you want, you can read any book you want, but if you're not working to the point that's breaking your heart,
Right.
that it doesn't matter what signposts and slogans you're working with.
That's
If
right.
I may give you an analogy, I've been
Sure.
a martial artist my whole life,
Hmm.
and I try to imagine a martial arts club where we just sell slogans. You know,
Yeah.
a calm fighter is a good fighter. Oh yeah, and
Yeah.
you know, uh, you more train, less pain. I said, yeah, that's great. And we just sit around and throw slogans around.
Right.
No,
Sure.
actually, we don't have any slogans. We
Good.
train, we train, we spar, we spar. Train,
Yeah.
spar, train, spar, stop talking.
Yeah. Great.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, whatever you want to say is going to come out of training, sparring, and mostly losing
Yes.
and coming back when you're lost
Yeah.
and feeling your ego destroyed, that you made a mistake and you're losing to people that you know you can beat. And you say to
Hmm.
yourself, the only person I want to beat is myself yesterday. I'm
Yeah.
going to,
Right.
my ego's at the door.
Yeah.
And what it takes to come back to I've been doing this for 50 years. What it takes to come back to a studio, there's depth and gumption there.
Yeah.
And I would say that's pre-religious.
Sure.
What it
Absolutely.
means to take on a physical discipline and come back no matter what. Well,
Hmm.
so I also use that analogy for spirituality.
Very nice.
So
Yeah.
if
Because.
I said, if you're not going to show up to the mat,
Hmm.
if you're not going to show up to the mat, you're not working a spiritual program or any religious program, whatever it is,
Yes.
because these things aren't earned from laziness. These things are earned from
That's right.
diligence and pain.
To borrow an analogy I heard, not sure where it originated, but it's kind of like, a person goes to a concert with a symphony, and they're sitting in there in the audience, and I'm going to choose Meditation by Massenet. That's a beautiful piece. I like it. So let's say the person who's sitting in the audience hears that beautiful piece. They One person goes home and says, "That's so beautiful. Let me buy the recording. I can hear it anytime I want to." I call that a spiritual experience as people think of spirituality today in the world. Another person goes home and says, "I'm going to buy a violin. I'm going to learn how to play. And one day I'm going to play that." To me, that's more of what we're describing here.
That's exactly
There's
right.
there's got to be some skin in the game, or you
Mhm.
got to have that motivation to be part of it.
Correct.
And
Right.
so, yeah, I think that's exactly right. And people talk about, well, they say things as if they're biblical quotes, like "live your truth" or "be true to yourself" or "as long as you're happy" or whatever. But I always respond to that with, what happened if two people's truths collide?
Yeah. And
You
how do you
know,
know it's your true? How do you know it's true? Just because you think it?
So, right.
As I guarantee, whatever you think is true today, talk to me in 10 years.
Yes.
You realize you're lying to yourself. So again, these are things that I hear. I just signed up for a program it's a high level Hebrew uh, institute. My Hebrew used to be fluent. Now it's a little bit unsound. I'm going to get back there.
Mine
So
is
the
way behind.
advertisement, yeah. So the advertisement was um, learn how to express your true self. My interviewer told me, man, did I have to restrain myself?
Oh, wow.
You assume that I have a true self. I just got to find the words, right? And that once I become more fluent in Hebrew, I will be able to express my true self as if everybody in Israel who speaks Hebrew walks around articulating their true self.
That's a,
But I didn't want to be that guy, right?
yeah, I
Okay,
I
so I
get it,
think
but yeah.
so. What does it mean to think that there's something called? I mean, I think of the true self as an activity, not an object.
Mhm.
What does it mean to enter into the life of truth? And then how do you speak it? And with whom do you speak it? And how
Yes.
do you continue the process of transformation? So these are very, very deep things. And I like when you say pre-religious, because no matter what your religion is, people that are working the Christian program, and they
Mhm.
are people of truth.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
you can oftentimes tell that when they study scripture, they break out crying because it's
Yes.
talking to them.
Mhm.
They're not measuring up. There's a two millennial old tradition calling them forth,
Yes.
and they realize I have a lot of work to do, and I don't have all the time in the world to do it.
Mhm.
Uh, so, I said one time, life is done with us before we're done with life, and you won't have forever. And so
Yeah.
when a person says, Rabbi Finley, I don't really understand what it means to pray, I said, are you ready? Are you ready to understand? Or are you just like saying, I don't understand, so I don't have to engage in it?
Yeah, I tried it once and it didn't work for me.
Yeah, exactly. Like I went to the doctor once, it didn't work for me, right?
Yeah. Very
So
good, very
anyway,
well.
so the idea I like the idea of responsibility. We have a responsibility to our soul. For we religious people, we have a responsibility to God.
Yes.
Moral people, we have to other people. I feel I have a responsibility to my tradition.
Absolutely.
Um, in this way, I'm conservative in the sense that I defer to my tradition, all things being equal, to my wisdom
Mhm.
tradition.
Sure.
Um, they've thought they've been thinking about it a long time. So if I'm going to disagree with them, I have to have a very good reason to disagree with the wisdom tradition that I've inherited, and it happens, but I have to really think it through. Now,
Sure.
when he says freedom of the will, that's interesting because we're not free. I mean, it's we're very rarely free. So remind me what Frankel means by freedom of the
Well,
will.
so what he means is he doesn't mean that you have unlimited freedom of the will. You have freedom within your circumstances to choose how you're going to deal with those circumstances. I mean, you may be in prison, you may not be able to change that. You lose a leg, you can't grow another one back, and that may not be exactly freedom of the will. But the point is that you when all other things are gone, and this is almost a direct quote from him, you still have the freedom to choose your attitude towards those circumstances, and
That's
of
exactly
course,
right. So
yeah.
so in the book of Deuteronomy it says God puts before us life and death, blessing and curse. Uvacharta b'chaim, choose
Mhm.
life.
That's right. Yeah.
So in every circumstance, we do have the will to see things and act on things, you might say, with a greater eye of truth, of integrity, of love, justice, etc.
Mhm.
Um, and we can catch ourselves when we find that something in us is choosing something different. So for me, the freedom of the will is something we have to recover,
Yes.
and I assume that's his project as well. We have to um, recover the freedom of the will by activating and strengthening the will of the higher self. Have you
That's
heard of
correct.
Roberto Assagioli? Maybe you've seen
Yeah,
him
yeah.
talk
Yes, actually,
about
his I have his
active
book
will.
here, and yes, and so I have colleagues in logotherapy who are very big on him.
Yeah.
Uh,
Okay. So I've been reading him since I discovered him in 1997,
mhm.
and the idea of the complexity of what it means to develop the will, exert the will, go from strong will to skillful will to the good will to the
Mhm.
divine will. I mean, it's a complex and wonderful book, and
Yes.
I've tried teaching it a few times, and people get lost. So I more or less try to extract the core, and I integrate it into my teaching. So the idea of for me, it's recovering the freedom of the will. And by the way, when I counsel people, that's one thing that they don't experience.
Mm.
People say to me, uh, I can't not get angry. They trigger me.
Yeah.
I said, you give me one day of your life, I swear I will train you not to be triggered.
Yeah. Right.
Right? I was in the Marine Corps.
Sure.
Whatever you do in the day before, the next day, right? Nobody got triggered.
Mhm.
Nobody got mad. Nobody got upset, right? Because they disincentivized acting on your emotions and they
Right.
incentivize acting on duty. So when a person says, "Oh, I can't stop," I said, I bet I can make you stop."
Yeah. Right.
And they say, "Okay, so I'm not going to join the Marines." I said, "Okay, so here's the best thing about the Marines or a good athletic coach. You've externalized your will to another person,
Right. Yes.
and they will provide the incentives and disincentives.
Mhm.
So you're in the unenviable position that the incentives and disincentives have to be self-created. So you can change.
Right.
You
Yeah.
just you lack the will and the skill, which I can provide you, but you have to do it. So people say, I can't change. I said, of course you can. I could change you in half a day. But but if I'm not there, right, you're going to go back to
Yeah.
your old self.
Yeah. Right.
So
Absolutely.
it's how we have to learn how to, number one, have a vision for you probably saw this in my work, have the vision for whom you want to become, the person you want
Yes.
to become, have the will affect it, and the precise skills throughout your life, precise skills that are required for that which you want to do. You want to be more spiritual, you want to know God, you have the vision, you have the will, and will you master the skills?
Yes.
That's a very, and again, I take this from Assagioli.
Sure. Well, but maybe this is an interesting segue to, I want to talk a little bit, if I may, about the Yetzer HaTov and the Yetzer Hara, or for everybody else, the good inclination or the bad inclination, or the e-
Mhm.
the I know there's a better way of expressing it in English, but
Well,
uh,
I'm glad you're halting in your definition, because nearly every definition is just wrong.
okay, glad to know that.
All right. So first of all, in Genesis chapter 6, verse 5, God is reflecting on, what happened until then. And God was sad unto God's soul, as it were, and notes, Kol Yetzer Machshavot Libo Rak Ra Kol Hayom.
Mhm.
Kol Yetzer. Now, Yetzer, Yetzer, is from the Hebrew root Yatzar,
Mhm.
which is the same verb root that was used when God shaped the Adamah, the earth, to create the Adam into which God blew the breath of life.
Yes.
So Yatzar means to shape. Now, God is, according to the story, I mean, the Genesis chapter 2 has a highly mythical feel.
Sure.
So God is the one who Yatzar, who shaped
Hmm.
the human being. And when he says, Kol Yetzer Machshavot Libo, as if there's another shape
Hmm.
of the thoughts of his lev. Now, lev usually
Heart.
means, but it actually means inner life.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
So all of the shape of the thoughts of his inner life, all bad, all day long.
Hmm.
So the best translation of Yetzer is shape.
Okay.
You can't get away with that because people
No.
are used to hearing inclination or urge.
Mhm.
So when I have a
Formation.
couple minutes, as I have with you,
Yes.
Yetzer Ra means a destructive shape, which means there's a shape, a configuration of your inner life.
Hmm.
Okay. So, which means it's filled with habits, assumptions, prisms, lenses, pathways, circuitry. There's a whole shape of something there. So when a person says, I want to change, you have to reshape that whole thing. Okay? So I like
Oh,
to call it the destructive shape.
okay. Nice.
Now, I don't like to use the term Yetzer Tov, although many people do, because A, it's not in the Bible, as far as I know.
Hmm.
And secondly, we call the Yetzer Hara Ra because there is you might say a criterion by which it is Ra, which is the neshama, the breath of God within us.
Hmm.
So we don't have to say good shape because we have a word for the good shape, which is the spirit or soul.
Got you.
So
Okay.
for me, saying Yetzer Tov
Hmm.
is just adding a word that doesn't need to be there. Now,
I see.
again, people use it, and I'll work with it. But I will say, along with Saggioli, if there's something called the spiritual shape, the soul or the spirit,
Hmm.
that is in opposition to the destructive shape, the problem is the higher shape is not animated with will and skill by itself. And that's a real mystery.
Hmm.
Because once I, Finley, or you, we discover, hey, that thing in me, that shape in me, is not creating goodness, it's not creating holiness, it's not serving me well, whatever that thing is, I got to work with it. And
Right.
you go to your higher self and you say, I shouldn't be doing this, I shouldn't be thinking this, I shouldn't be acting this way, I should act a different way, and you come to it. Now the question is the will.
Mhm.
So the vision, the highest vision is a function of the neshama, of the spirit. But we, as it were, at the other end of this whole process, who say, well, I have this neshama and I have this yetzirah, and here I am here, and I know it's not working well. How do we know that? Okay. Then we have to go back and fund the spirit soul with will. Now, this is a real mystery to me
Hmm.
that that we have to do the work to provide the will to the Spirit. Now, it's
Right.
obvious that we do. I don't
Yeah.
have a theory. I only have enough theory to know that we have to do it. So I don't use the word Yetzer Tov. I'm sorry for this such a long
Okay.
misplaced, but I
No,
know
that's
you're.
no, I'm perfectly fine with that.
I thought you would appreciate this.
Yeah,
So
I
I use
do. I
the
appreciate
term. I use the destructive shape
it. Hmm.
in opposition to the neshama, spirit or soul, and that our lifelong work is to animate soul spirit
Hmm.
to provide it with the will that we can over our life diminish the destructiveness of this destructive
Yes.
shape.
That's very interesting because my mind, of course, cobwebs are going out in many different directions. Um, so the three pillars of logotherapy are the freedom of the will to meaning, and the meaning of life. In addition to that, Frankl argued, and this is always I've had I don't know if I completely buy it, but I do buy it, and I'll just say what it is. That whereas the body can get sick, the mind can get sick. He argued that the spirit is uninjurable,
Mhm,
and that the spirit is can be hindered. You
mhm,
know, like you can have, you could be bipolar, you can have schizophrenia, but it doesn't change the fact that you have somewhere behind this cloud an uninjured spirit. That's his approach
mhm,
to it, and
mhm,
that means that the will to meaning, or the will to do things, comes from the spiritual realm, which he called nous.
mhm.
Now, from the Greek word, but here's the problem: every word that we use means what you want it to mean, and what you don't want it to mean. So,
Right.
for instance, Geist can mean spirit, or it can mean mind.
Mhm,
Psyche, we think of it as meaning mind, but the Greek word means soul. You
mhm,
know,
mhm,
and even nous, as Frankel uses it, he wants it to mean spirit. He doesn't know that the Apostle Paul and the Greek Orthodox tradition use the word nous to talk about mind,
mhm.
but not
Yeah,
mind in terms of the brain or the conscious mind, but the higher function. So we're
you're
always
exactly right.
tripping over this terminology,
Right.
uh, and the
That's why
wider.
I put a lot of time into precise definitions.
Yeah.
So if I'm going to say spirit, I define it.
Mhm.
And if I'm going to say soul, I define it.
Yes.
If I were to say nous, I would define it. So I have to have ready-made definitions
Yes.
so people can use the tool and so that we make sure we're talking about the same thing.
Right. Define our terms.
Yeah. So that's very, by the way, in my wisdom work where we have virtue, rationality, um, uh, I'll call the next one insight and regulation and a life of depth. The second one, precision, is really the most challenging thing for people
Mm.
is to think precisely because people are not used to thinking precisely. So, if he were to say there's an uninjurable part in the inner life of the human being, let's say that's what he's saying.
Mhm.
Something we'll say is deeply recessed into some metaphoric space that um, all of the negativity of life and the pain of life, it can't get to it. All right. So I have a metaphor you might like. I call it the temple, the field, and the fence.
Okay.
Okay. So the temple is where that is. It's in the
Okay.
recesses of the temple.
Hmm.
Around the temple is the field, and that's consciousness that
Hmm.
has to be cultivated constantly.
Sure.
And the fence is trying to keep out the negative forces.
Hmm.
So it's a magic fence. You open the vents to let the positive in, and you close the vents to keep the negative out.
I
However,
see.
the negative gets in and creates
Sure.
toxic dumps in the field. So now you have your work to do. And then it like the blob, it crawls up the steps into the temple
I
and it
see.
gets
Right.
into the temple. It starts
Yes.
to seep into the temple.
Right.
And a person has despair, crisis of faith. They don't believe anything. Everything's meaningless. Like you're nearly suicidal college sophomore that says nothing means anything
Right.
because the destructive forces have gotten into the temple. Now, I have to believe there it's like in the Maccabean myth, the one cruise of oil that
Yes.
lasted for 8 days. There's some hidden chamber that the negativity can't get to.
Yes.
Okay, now again, here's the odd thing. Whom am I talking to go find it? Right?
That's
Because the person is not that, but I'm going to say, look, I get it. Despair, it's all the man, nothing means anything. All your teachers lie, your parents lied to you, you know, the opposite sex, they're all fickle. Why put in all this effort when it all ends like your marriage, your parents' terrible marriage and your unhappy mother, and you're saying, why should I do this? Why did I just end it early? I said, I have an answer for you, but it's going to be difficult. So
mhm,
I need to, I've had a few clients like this, 19 years
sure.
old, that I had to lead them
Mhm.
to that place that Franco's talking about.
Yes.
So the good news is it's uninjurable. The bad news is it is hidden
That's
deeply
right.
within the temple and it's very hard to find.
That's right. And for
And
some people, they're
I
in
have to believe
denial
it's
of it.
there. Yeah, I have to believe it's there,
Yeah.
and I do believe it's there,
Yeah.
because I've led myself to it, and I've led other people to it, as I'm sure you have.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, I think that is in many ways the crux of what we call logotherapy is to help people find that uninjurable spirit. But I guess you can't really do that until they have recognized it, and that's one of the dangers of psychodynamic uh, psychology and so forth in terms of if it's just about the mind and the body, if there is not a higher self or an injured spirit in
For
their
example,
thinking.
they actually don't have a sense. See, when they say we have the super ego, the ego, and the id,
Yes.
and the id is pushing, super ego clamps down, and the ego gets squeezed. I say, okay, so who came to therapy?
Right. Yes. Right.
Uh, Who,
And
who, who are you talking to? You're talking to the guy that has these three dynamic forces within him. What about me? And, and as I learn about this from you, you want me to activate some kind of teaching to relieve the stress of the ego, push the super ego back up, and regulate the id in a kind way. Who am I?
yeah.
And according to what? Why is this good? Why ought I do it? Because I'm suffering? That's the only reason I should do this. There's no other telos to the human being other than I should feel good. So I mean, I just you could imagine
It falls
I
short, doesn't it? I mean, it's not
it totally
satisfying, and
falls
that's
short.
why.
Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely. I
By the way, I love
appreciate.
your definition of logotherapy. I mean,
Thank you.
I know you're bringing down from the master, but I've never thought of that hidden crystalline quartz as logotherapy.
Mhm.
Because when I think of logos, I think more of purpose, meaning, mind of
Sure.
God, etc.
Mhm.
Not the you know the hidden gem that we
Mhm.
have to find and bring
Sure.
out to push back the destructive forces. But if that's how you
Right.
define logotherapy, I really love it.
Well, again, we have a problem where we're going from German to English, and in German, Frankl called it Existenzanalysis, or I know I'm not saying that correctly, existential analysis.
Mm.
But when you take Ludwig Binswanger's Dasein analysis and translate it into English, you get the same word, existential analysis.
Right.
So, uh, for the sake of English, and I guess English is the Franco lingua franca now. We say logotherapy and existential analysis.
Mm.
So it's really, everybody's read Man's Search for Meaning, and they think that's all there is to Viktor Frankl. But I have here, a textbook on. It's just called "On the Theory and Therapy of Mental Disorders," which is quite dense and quite a. He wrote many books, and I would recommend "The Will to Meaning," which is he taught at a seminary in the United States.
Very
Um,
good.
you
I've
see,
read his Man's Search for Ultimate Meaning.
yes, that's absolutely great. And the thesis of that book, as a matter of fact, if you don't mind, I'll share my screen.
Please do.
How are we doing on time? Are you good or you
We're
need to
fine. We're
go?
fine. Yeah.
Okay. So, I did prepare a few things here, and what I did, I sometime back, oops, I didn't do what I should have done. Let me go back to, there we go. And I'm going to share screen. What am I doing wrong here? Well,
Okay.
You're not seeing my
We're
PowerPoint, right?
we're back. Uh, I assume it's a screen in your browser or something, or
Yeah, I was going to pull up PowerPoint, but basically the thesis to Man's Search for Ultimate Meaning is that there is in every man uh, a deeply held religious instinct, and that's not the right words. This is my paraphrase because I'm not pulling up the other page. And then he goes on to say, even in the case of psychosis or neurosis, and this is again getting back to the concept of the uninjured spirit. And then he
Mhm,
gives you talked about a lot of your success has come from anecdotal experience,
mhm,
which is kind of what he also did, but he began to refer to it as phenomenological evidence because if this is something that you observe in people anywhere and everywhere,
mhm,
then you can scientifically, I think, call it
mhm,
phenomenological. And he includes dream interpretation, where you may have someone who's an atheist or an agnostic, and yet they have these deeply religious dreams.
mhm,
But my favorite part in the book, it may be in Will to Meaning, but anyway, one of my favorite quotes from him is about Joan of Arc.
mhm,
You know, from a psychodynamic point of view, Joan of Arc is only one thing: she's schizophrenic,
mhm,
or as we say today in first person language, she is a person experiencing schizophrenia.
mhm,
But it doesn't change the fact, he says, that she was also a saint.
mhm,
And he talks about working with all kinds of religious people, Jewish, Christian, and otherwise, who have these deep neuroses based upon, guilt or whatever that they're experiencing in their religious life, and how they work through these things. But the point is that even someone who is psychotic, who has these illnesses, can experience the spirit. And
mhm,
one example I give is we had a guy who wandered in here one night. The doors were unlocked, and he was in a home. He was probably in his 30s. I would say, just guessing, I'm not a doctor. I would say he was either schizophrenic or bipolar. He was hearing voices. He was off his meds. He got away from his caretaker, and had been wandering for hours. And he knew to come into a church.
mhm,
And he came in and he was asking help. And when we talked with him, he was listening. When we were not talking with him, he was saying, "God, forgive me, a sinner." He was, I think it's a Catholic prayer.
mhm,
It's called the Jesus prayer or whatnot. And he was quoting scripture and doing this, that, and the other. And we would talk to him and he would be focused. And otherwise, he'd be quoting scripture. But clearly, he was having an episode, for
mhm,
lack of a better term.
mhm,
We managed to, through his phone, to get in touch with his caregiver. And sometime later, they came to get him. But this is similar to stories that Frankl told
mhm,
uh, about people. And the point is, a young lady in one of the concentration camps, probably in, not Theresienstadt, one of the last ones he was in, she had been very promiscuous. And one way she kind of put it off the inevitable for as long as possible was by being promiscuous with Nazi guards. But
mhm,
at some point, I'm sure she had contracted syphilis or whatever. And she had basically become more or less insane.
mhm,
And he said he had treated her about an hour or so before she died. And there she was, just like a scene out of Faust. She was laying on straw, covered in filth. And
mhm,
the only thing she knew to say was Shema Yisrael,
mhm,
you
mhm,
know, that her dying words, no matter how far gone she was, she knew she needed to pray.
mhm,
And so that's kind of where that whole concept is, that
mhm,
deep inside, we can deny it, we can ignore it, we can do whatever, but there is this religious connection to God, whether we acknowledge it or access it or not.
mhm.
I find that very appealing.
Yeah, yeah. I use the term phenomenology to talk about the study of experience. When people say, "Do I believe in God?" I say, "I experience God."
Yes.
Um, so with the anecdotal evidence for me is it's like individual testimony of their spiritual path
Hmm.
from which I can infer wisdom.
Yes.
So I use anecdotes for inference, and I've had so many similar anecdotes that I will say it accrues to a feature of the human condition until I start to hear vastly different anecdotes from suffering people. So, so there is wisdom in listening to what I tend to call archetypal.
Mhm.
Because when I look at all the counseling that I've done, including when people ask questions in class, they slot into, for me, a finite number of spiritual archetypes or spiritual personalities. Let's say, for arguments purposes, there's about 10 of them. So
Mhm.
I may have a couple, you might have a couple, and then you meet somebody and you can say, oh, I've heard the skeptic before. I've heard the intellectual before. I've heard the angry at God before. I've never been a skeptic. I've never been angry at God.
Mhm.
Um, but I have my spiritual personality. Uh, so um, so I think within their spiritual personalities, now I'm paraphrasing Eric Fromm and M. Scott Peck,
Mhm.
where he says neurosis comes from people not knowing how to suffer with dignity.
Hmm.
So they find ways to avoid suffering.
Right.
Um, so neurotically obsessed with one's mother or one's father or with one's own looks or one's own sexuality. There's
Mhm.
some core insufficiency inside of a person that they can't face with wisdom and dignity and honor. Really, there's a soul in there that's trying to find its way, and they find some other way
Yes.
to treat their suffering without wisdom. So I mean I'm learning a lot from you, and I really so
Oh, well,
I'm sparking back to what you're saying.
I very much
That,
appreciate that.
that when I hear somebody and I say and they tell me what they're going through, I said, so tell me how you're dealing with it. Your child is disrespectful and you're doesn't love you anymore, and they're lying and they're hiding and disagreeable. And I said, how are you addressing it? So I had this one father says, well, I try to teach him. And so I know I right away know A, what's wrong, and B, what's gone wrong in the relationship. Because what I'd hope he would say is, I try to listen to him.
Right. Yeah.
So I said, and how does your son? Well, he won't listen. He argues back. And I'm thinking to myself, he says, I want to be your client. I want to learn wisdom. I said, it's going to be hard for you because I'm going to offer a first teaching for you. I said, stop teaching your son, stop giving your son advice. But he needs me and I'm his father. I said, okay, look, I'm telling you the first teaching because every person has a different first teaching, right?
Yes. Right.
Your first teaching is stop teaching your son and stop advising your son. Just stop completely.
Yeah.
And so he ruminated on that. And I said, I want you to start listening to your son's story without contradicting, without intervening, without offering. Just say, son, I want to hear your story. And don't respond.
Mm.
To say thank you so much. I so appreciate your opening up to me. He couldn't do it.
Mhm.
He could not do it because his son brought him so much shame. His son, this is a very, is a Persian Jewish family where there's a lot of honor at stake. And by the way,
Sure.
this is only one of dozens. But if my son does not bring honor to the family, I must correct him. And they do it in the most heavy-handed ways.
Yes.
And so he's suffering. He's suffering because his son's bringing dishonor to the family.
Mhm.
So his idea is hammer the son into shape.
Right.
So not only are you suffering, I'm going to destroy the kid as well. Right? Now, I would call that neurotic.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yes.
So I would say there's a better way to handle your suffering, which is um, listen to your son's suffering.
Mhm.
Don't try to hammer it out of him. The son is symptomizing his suffering. You want to
Sure.
hammer the symptoms. And I've had the great fortune that when a person tells me about their recalcitrant teenager, and I say, okay, so I'm gonna, I said, you want the long path or the short path? Because I can, if you want to spend a lot of money until I tell you the truth, you can do it that way, or I can save you a lot of money. I can just tell you right
Yeah.
now. And they say, okay, tell me right now. I said, stop giving your kid advice.
Yeah. Right.
Stop right now.
Yeah.
They said, what do I have to do if I mess them up? Say, have them explain to you why. Say, look, I'm not telling you what to do. I want you to tell me why you think either thought, feel, urges, or something that was the right thing to do.
Mhm.
I don't like those gangsters you're hanging out with, but something in you does. So I'm not telling you to stop.
Mhm.
I want you to explain to me why it makes sense to you,
Yeah. Right.
right? And the
Yep.
kid says, I don't know. And say I know you don't know because probably no one ever probably asked you. I'm not going to judge you, but
Right.
something in you has looked at the gangster archetype and says, I want to be in there. Say, I said,
Mhm.
I said, when I've had kids like this, I think I know why, because they're tough. and they don't care, and they transgress, and they're
Hmm.
above I mean, they conform in their own culture, but they don't seem to conform to the bourgeois culture. So it's kind of a rebel. And they go, exactly, exactly.
Hmm.
They don't like the teachers, and they push back, and they don't do this, and they don't do that. And I said, and you want to join that and be part of that culture. They said, I get it, totally get it, man. I totally
Hmm.
get it. You're not gonna tell me to stop. I said, what do I know? I don't know anything, but I want to tell you one thing is whatever you're going to do, I want you to understand yourself. Don't be a mystery to yourself.
Yeah.
And if you're looking for toughness, if you're looking for flout the rules, you can choose it in ways that might not lead to an early death. Because I knew those guys in high school and they all died young,
Yep.
right?
Hmm.
So you have a choice ahead of you. You know, going back to what you said earlier. Now that we know what you're after, you know where these guys are going to end up. I understand why you're driven to them. You have to choose what you do now. Now that you have some knowledge that might actually turn into wisdom.
Absolutely.
And the kids walk away from that and say, like, thank you. The first person that didn't shame me, yell at me, tell me that I'm bad. I said, no, you have an archetypal drive to something, and I get it.
Yeah, that's right.
And and now try to train a parent to do that.
Ah,
Can you
yeah.
imagine? But I've had some parents who've done it.
Mhm.
Their relationship with their kid turned 180 degrees on a dime. On a
Yes.
dime.
Yeah.
Okay, that's wisdom works. I have a class called Parenting the Soul of the Child. So I
Hmm.
teach this exact skill. Whatever they're doing, there might be an archetypal drive to do it.
Sure. Yeah.
Have them explain the drive. Give the drive voice. Jung would call it a God. There's a God operating in them that is that
Mhm.
is seeking expression.
Yes.
Have them tell you about that. And parents said, I call the parent soul of the child. The parent said, I understand my child, and now my child understands herself.
That's right. Yeah. Very
And so it's
nice.
just incredible, just a very basic wisdom work skill. This is in the depth part of the factory,
Hmm. Sure.
which is archetypal drives to self-expression that are manifested in culture.
Hmm. Right.
So gang is a cultural message.
That's right.
Yeah. I mean, like for everyone, when I joined the Marines,
Hmm.
it was a cult, it was like it was, I thought about it a lot before I joined up, but I knew that I had an archetypal drive that had to get expressed culturally.
Yes.
And I would explain to people, they said, wow, we don't know anybody who thought that through. I said, here, I had good teachers, I had good guides that really pressed me,
Hmm.
and they drove me to self-understanding. Not that I didn't do it, but that I knew what I was doing, which made the whole experience much better. So
Sure.
so I think in logotherapy, this fits right in with logotherapy, right?
Yes.
Find the
Yes. I think so.
meaning behind what you're doing,
That's
right?
right.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, exactly. So it doesn't matter
Absolutely.
what religion you are,
Hmm.
right?
Right.
You could come from a good Presbyterian, Methodist, conservative Jewish home, and the kid wants to join a gang,
That's right. Mhm. Absolutely. And that
right?
just makes us human. And that to
Right.
me is very important. I talk about sometimes, obviously, I'm in my office. I have lots of books on display here. But in my younger days, for me, it was about learning to read and interpret the Bible correctly, learning Hebrew and Greek, and uh, making sure I don't make any mistakes in interpretation.
Hmm.
But between being in the ministry, I also spent 20 years bivocationally as a teacher and as a part-time minister. Now I'm back in full-time ministry. My point is that as I get older, I realize what's really important is being able to understand and read people and connect with them on the human level. You can't get the theological part of it right if you can't get the human part of it right.
That's exactly right.
And so
Yeah. So here's an alarming idea that you may have already
yeah,
thought, but I'm thinking it. In your devotion to get the Bible right,
yes.
that was your Yetzer Hara.
It was absolutely, and I'm going to just mention this briefly. You don't need to go into it necessarily, but for me, you talk about uh, the Kabbalistic approach. I like the Enneagram and the
By the way, I too,
similarities. Yeah, and I know that did Gurdjieff work too. I believe you
right?
mentioned.
Gurdjieff and Enneagram work.
Okay,
Yeah, for
and
sure.
so there is this tendency. Growing up, it was called your besetting sin. That thing where you tend to gravitate to, and I identify as a one. And when I realized, of course, I think we're all nine of those things,
Of
more or
course.
less. But I think that when I realized the tendency to lean towards the one, it wasn't about all the different things I was doing. It was about the resentment that drove it.
Mhm.
That, and the other thing I like about Enneagram is that what is your besetting sin or your root sin or whatever, it can also be your gift. It depends
Absolutely.
on if you hold it. And this is what you were talking about in one of the podcasts I listened to when you're talking about the Kabbalah. You've got these, you know,
Different
your
sefirot, right?
yeah, this Sphirot, and you're kind of working between Gevurah and Din or whatever. I know I'm not remember or
Chesed and
Chesed and
Gevurah is where the
Gevurah,
basic polar tensions are.
you
Yeah,
know. And so we're talking about finding that balance and hopefully leaning towards a more mature side rather than the immature
yeah.
represent, because you talk about how any manifestation of those qualities could be bad or good,
Mhm.
kind of depending on how. Am
Right.
I going too far in that?
No,
In
no, not no, no. So have you read the Risso Hudson Wisdom of the Enneagram?
Yes, absolutely. That was a big part of mine.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So they have the idea of the of high, mid, and low
Yes.
functioning
Yes.
types. So the high functioning one, mid, and low functioning one.
Right.
So the low functioning is the righteous reformer,
Yes.
correct everybody else, correct
Mhm,
yourself, never happy.
mhm.
And you move up and you say, hey, there's stuff in the world that has to be repaired, and I'm gonna be the guy that's motivated to do it. That's a very high functioning one.
Yeah.
So I love the Enneagram. And by the way, the Enneagram helped me teach Kabbalah much better because I
Yeah.
began to talk about high, mid, and low functioning sefirot. They're
Yes.
not
Yes.
readable on each other like
I agree. I agree. I
but
agree.
anyway, it really helped me become a better teacher of the spiritual psychology of Kabbalah. I still love Enneagram, still refer to it. It's like it's a tool in the in my tool belt.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Now, a person will be
It's up
talking,
here, right?
yeah, and I say, okay, listen, I'm going to bring down some Enneagram on you. You are such a classic four. I got to tell you what you're up with. Like that Gnostic search, the pain of life. You're a
Yeah,
type, and there's a way to do it. And I'm not a four, but I think I know how to help a four.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, you're onto some good stuff, man.
Thank
Well,
you.
it's good because everything you do, I do. So we're like we're mirroring each other.
That's why I really appreciated this opportunity to talk. And again, I hope again in the future sometime.
Sure.
Before we close, I would like to ask, you are now located in Israel, is that correct?
Right. We actually moved to Israel 6 weeks ago. Arrived 6 weeks ago.
Wow. Okay. So, and what a time to make Aliyah, right? Is it
Right. It was
you
because
call it
of the
Aliyah?
time.
Yeah. And so, have you had the opportunity then to work with people who are, I don't want to use jargon necessarily, but definitely traumatized, and what's it like to be, you know, there at this time, and so forth.
Sure. Sure. Yes. First of all, if I'm going to give you a couple minutes on it because I think it's worth it.
Yeah, sure.
Our eldest daughter was in Canada on vacation in October,
Hmm.
and she had tickets to the Nova Festival.
Wow.
But my wife's birthday is October 7th. So she
Okay.
called me and said, should I go back to the festival or should I come down to Southern California and surprise Ema,
Mhm.
mommy for her birthday? I said, come on down here. You're close. There'll be another festival. That's why she wasn't there
Mm.
because of her mother's birthday.
Well, praise the Lord, right?
Yeah, praise the Lord. Our other daughter was camping in the Negev, not far from Gaza.
Wow.
And so they were down in a guy, like a arroyo,
Hmm.
um, completely disconnected. So we couldn't get a hold of her. But she has a hiking club,
I see.
and they were getting call after call. So they finally about noon climbed up to the ridge, and all their phones just went crazy.
Sure.
They finally found their way to a military officer. He says, "Climb back down there, stay, don't get on the roads. Now we know where you are. We'll let you know." Okay, so we went through just the randomness, God's providence, or the randomness of our daughters alive and whole.
Mhm.
Um, our other daughter, who was disappeared for 12 hours, was found, and you can
Mm.
imagine what that was like.
Amen. Yeah, right.
Yeah. And then our elder daughter, who was in military intel when she was in the army here, she created what's called a citizens initiative. We're not waiting for the government, of getting all of her old intel crew together and tracking people down using their phones and computers.
Yes, I see.
And they were good at that. And so she did it. She was in a month in Los Angeles, creating a network of ex-Intel people, and then they finally handed it over to a quasi-government organization.
I see.
So they came back, and I thought as soon as the teaching year ends after Hanukkah, I'm going over there. So my wife and I went over in January, and this is when I discovered this. I did a little introductory lecture on the spiritual psychology of Kabbalah to her friends who wanted, oh, your dad does Kabbalah. We want to know about it. And I went straight to human brokenness.
Mm, I see.
And they said, no one tells us about brokenness. No one tells us about that. It's the human condition. And this has exacerbated our brokenness. And there's a way to work through brokenness. They said, you have to come here. They said to me and my wife, we need you. You have to be here.
I see.
And then one day I volunteered to pick lemons on a moshav down by the Gaza Strip where all the foreign workers had gone home. And there were people from all over the world. There was from China, Africa, Germany, Israel, Northern Israel,
Mhm.
and just came down there to pick fruit. I mean, doctors and lawyers and afterwards, all these different agricultural settlements, they all collected us all to one mifgash, a meeting place of the buses to take us back to Tel Aviv. And there were soldiers who came back from the front to get sandwiches. This was in January.
Mhm.
There were colonels there were privates there were reporters there. And I just had this out of body experience that this is epic,
Mhm.
that there's something epic happening of people coming across the world, whatever the newspapers are saying.
Right.
They had 1,200 people butchered.
Yeah.
We're fighting back.
Mhm.
Right? And whatever you want to say about Palestinian state, say it. But Hamas is evil.
Mhm.
And these guys are going back in there every day fighting evil.
Yeah.
People who said they're going to do it 10,000 more times, they're not stopping. That's what Hamas said.
That's right.
And 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 we said we can't let our daughters go through this alone.
Mhm.
This is a moment in Jewish history that I must live through personally
Yes.
and in Western civilization. I'm one of those people that, I'm kind of a neocon where American military and political might has to be used to fight evil. And I think Iran and China and Russia and North Korea, they're an axis of evil. And this is the front line for Western civilization. I really believe it. I'm not overstating it. Because
No, I don't either, because if you look at the build up to World War II and look at how, states are doing what they're doing these days, it looks an awful lot alike.
yeah. So we in the and Western civilization is crumbling for many reasons, and America is the last holdout.
Yeah.
We're the strong last holdout. There are other places that are struggling, but they don't have what we have. And I thought to myself, as an American and as a Jew, I've got to be here. And really, it felt like the hand of God upon me.
Hmm.
And when I got back to the hotel, I said to my wife, we're making Aliyah. She said, I've been wanting to do it for years. What happened to you? And I said, I was out picking lemons, and Spirit of God, like Saul, descended upon me, and I became a
Yeah.
different man. And so we went back and right away got to, selling our house. And I still have my congregation. I'm still online, every Friday night, Saturday morning, LA time, and I'm trying to keep this thing together. But
Sure.
so anyway, that's me here. Now, when I meet people and they say, what, you came now, people are leaving. And they would say, and they agree like 10 problems that Israel is facing. And a lot of them is, Netanyahu this and this one, this. And I say, okay, I should take a deep breath. You're Jewish, right? Yes. I said, 1948, we reconstituted the Jewish Commonwealth. If a Jew can be here, they should be here. This is
Mhm.
destiny. And when you say this is the most right-wing government in Israel history, I said, what's the most left-wing government in Jewish history, in Israel history? Well, they don't know. I said, it's a slogan.
Yes.
But there was a most left-wing government. And you know what the religious didn't do? They didn't pack up and leave.
That's right.
They said, okay, so we don't like these secular people bossing us around. We're going to try to change things. So here you are, a secular Jew, and your decision is to leave, is to run, not fight for something you value. That's why we came here. We came to fight for things we value, because this is the one chance we're going to have a Jewish state. If this doesn't work, it's gone forever. And you're running. And people say, like someone you're going to buy a car from, they said, you've inspired me to stay. So
Hmm.
my wife and I have had many conversations that we said, thank you so much. We see your suffering. Can we share our opinion? And people say, thank God you came. You need to get out there and speak more. So it's like one person at a time. Eventually, I don't know. But what's it been like here? A lot of pain.
Yeah.
Um, um, the pain for the hostages, the pain for the soldiers and others who are dying. We just had a terrorist attack 2 weeks ago. A bomb landed in Tel Aviv from the Mediterranean. We just had a truck bomb go off, a little, about a half a mile south of us. So
Mm.
we know they're in their crosshairs, um, but we're not going anywhere. So there's a sense of day to day, taking care of life, being
Mhm.
with other people, being with our children in the background. I also have an ultra Orthodox son who's way up north, but he's older. He has 5 kids. I'm talking about
Mhm. Sure.
our single girls that don't have families yet.
Yeah, right. Okay.
People are asking us to start teaching, and we're getting around to it. So um, I feel utterly fulfilled.
How about that? That sense of purpose that
Purpose and all my intellectual work, all my spiritual studies, all the Kabbalah is coming down to a focus. I never thought I would be so intellectually, spiritually, mentally, personally
Mhm.
fulfilled as I am at this point in my life.
Yeah. So
This
it's not the
has to be
sorry.
God's work.
Amen to that. It's not the absence of a conflict or of
Right.
stress or pressure. It is a sense of meaning or purpose that
Yeah. I got into a therapist say, "Oh, you're in Israel because you have guilt toward your father," right?
uh
Right, right.
yeah.
Yeah, no,
Yeah, well,
yeah, we agree. There's something bigger than me here, and I got to.
there's a great passage where Franco writes about where some volunteers who probably the American was it called the one that Kennedy started the anyway
Peace Corps.
the thank you, the Peace Corps.
Right,
And they were told, well, the reason you're doing this is because you feel superior and you will help people that are inferior and all
right,
this. And
right.
Franco's point was, well, when you begin to unmask everybody's motives and then you just keep unmask, sooner or later we have to ask, what are the motives of the person who's
Right.
doing the unmasking?
Right.
Somewhere along the line, maybe you're just trying to deny something that's real.
That people are virtuous. They want to help others.
That's correct. Yes,
So this
yes.
idea of the critique of of the egotism, which is we only do what's in our interest. What a vile notion
Yeah, right.
that nobility and honor are impossible. So people say, you only do it in your interest. I said, yeah, how do you know that truth? And how do you know it's true? And why are you saying it? It's exactly what you're saying. And why are you saying it to me? And how do you know that it's true? How do you know that people are not motivated by honor, virtue, and self-sacrifice? How do you know that? You think it, but you don't know it. So I
And
want to
you
tell you,
witnessed it every day there
yeah,
in Israel.
yeah,
Somebody's
and throughout my whole life when I was in the military,
yeah,
I mean, there was enough people who joined the Marines because of God, country, and core. We
mhm,
believed in it. We believed that I'm here to take a bullet for a civilian.
right.
I'm here to be the military arm of the greatest country that's ever existed on the face of the earth, right? So people try to do that to me. I just say, how do you know that? And maybe you're wrong, and I actually think you're wrong. So
Yeah,
stop it. You know.
very
So
nice.
yeah, that cynical reductionism that everything is flat and there's no meaning. Wow, what a miserable life they must be living,
I
right?
know. What kind of world does that lead to? Well, it leads to a world of psychopaths and and we're kind of living in an age of psychopathy, I think,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
maybe we have to find a way to reverse that trend and
Well,
sort
listen,
of
I wish you're doing great work, and I can tell you're a man of deep faith
thank you.
with a great intellectual skills and a really compassionate heart. I just wish you all the success
I
that you
appreciate
can
that very
possibly
much.
have, because you're gonna save lives and change lives.
Well, I do
You're gonna
have
continue to change lives and save lives.
my situation is not as dramatic as yours, but I do have that sense of focus and purpose that
Somebody's gonna
I am
stroll into
where
your
I
church, and you will change a life and a generation of lives just because they happened upon you one day. So don't undersell yourself. There's no war on, but there is a war on, right?
yes, there is in many,
Yeah,
many ways. And I very much appreciate your time today. And
a
I
pleasure.
don't be a stranger, of course, and feel
No,
free
and
to
anytime, yeah, like we have a good groove. So
thank you
anytime
for that.
you want to talk and run something by me, we'll entertain ourselves and maybe other people find it meaningful too.
Well, let me stop the recording now and then
Okay?
just a last word here.
Okay.